Welcome to Speaking of Humanism. I'm Emily Newman, the American Humanist Association's education coordinator. This is part of a monthly series, and tonight we're excited to bring you Dr. David Orenstein. He's a tenured full professor of anthropology at CUNY Medgar Evers College. He's an international speaker and author on science education, evolution acceptance, and human rights. He's currently on the broader social impacts committee of the Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, and previously was the American Humanist Association's representative to the United Nations. So thank you and welcome to David Orenstein.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. I am so pleased to be here. You know, the genesis of my being here in 2021 is that in 2020, both I and my co-author were supposed to actually present in person pre-COVID on Darwin's Apostles, which is the book that was published by the American Humanist Association. Tonight's discussion is Darwin as freethought apical ancestor, meaning that he is a nexus person in our ideas related to secular humanism, science, philosophy, and incredibly important to those areas that I think we as humanists or secularists hold very important, especially if we accept the material universe as it is. Before we start, I think it's really important to, as we honor the birth of Darwin on February 12th, remember that today, February 11th, is National Day of Women and Girls in Science, and it's also Black History Month. And so there are a lot of commemorations going on, and it's very important that we mention these things because, you know, there's a real long overdue acknowledgement of the role and importance of women and people who don't look like me, who have enlivened our lives through their work in the sciences and the social sciences. And for a very long time, those stories were not really told, partially because of our own ignorance, but partially because of this very strong patriarchy, which dismissed a lot of the important contributions of people who were not considered mainstream, even within science, which itself has been sort of this quote unquote old boys network. So we can go back in history and talk about Hypatia and Curie, and of course, the hidden figures of Johnson and Vaught and Jackson, and not forget Jane Goodall or Penny Patterson of the Gorilla Foundation, or Meave Leakey, and literally thousands, if not millions of more women and girls in all facets of the social sciences, the behavioral sciences, computer science, that have made our world better because of their work within the discovery and uncovery of nature. So I'm a big fan of the late Mr. Rogers, who for a very long time would say that we have to always remember the people who loved us into being. And what I'd like to do now is just take about 20 seconds, not in prayer, but in memory of those women and girls, those people who are indigenous, those people who are Black and brown skinned, those people who are from a minority, who may have touched your life in the sciences, but outside of the sciences. So I'd like to take about 20 seconds and just give everyone a chance to think about them. And I'll watch the clock. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for humoring me. And I hope that if you did think about someone and practice this form of meditation, that their memory stands out in your life and you can emulate their good works. So we're here to talk about Darwin. And as an anthropologist, I'm very holistic in my approach. So we'll be going back and forwards in time in a few aspects of this presentation. And if we think about this as um, a, a clock with sand in it that sort of goes like this, we could start with the worldwide acknowledgement of what evolution means. In fact, if you ask people in the sciences, what are the most definitive and important discoveries or uncoveries that science has made, whether it be vaccination or the RNA and DNA or mathematics, you find that evolution is always within that top 10 because it's had so many implications for the rest of our lives. And going forward, will have an incredibly important place in human knowledge. In a less scientific discussion of the importance of Charles Darwin, the Time magazine did a study some years ago where they said, who were the 100 most important people in history that you could think of? And Charles Darwin came in as number 12. So not even just amongst people who are like me, who is a scientist, or people who might have a knowledge of Charles Darwin, that there's a perception in the laity that Charles Darwin's work was fundamental and important. And what I always like to do in terms of a thought experiment is sort of remove the religious, the fascist, the slaveholders, and the conquerors. And if you take out those different people, you find that Charles Darwin is no longer number 12, but comes in as number 4 in that list of top 100 people. For those of you who remember Casey Kasem and remember American Top 40, Charles Darwin is going up there like a bullet. So, like I said, we're going to go back and forth. And I think one thing that we have to do is really look at how not only Charles Darwin affected humanism, but affected other areas of our knowledge. And John Dewey wrote about Darwin 50 years after the publication of Origin of Species in 1859. And here he is in around 1910. I won't read the whole thing, but it's clear that Dewey, who as a social thinker and as an educator, saw the importance and the revolution caused by Darwin's work in Origin of Species and later Descent of Man. And you find that also 100 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote in The Evolution of the Race Problem, that Darwin's work was liberating away from not only physical slavery, but also intellectual slavery. And so here you are, not 50 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, and you find that social thinkers 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 years later still rely on Darwin from various disciplines to discuss his work and the importance of Darwin's work, not only for biology, but also in philosophy as well. When we think about natural selection, it is not in itself a new idea. We can go back to the 7th century BCE to Anaximander, who said that all life rose from the sea. Plato and Aristotle talked about the precursor of the great chain of being. And so there are philosophers and scientists who are talking about what we would understand thousands of years ago, thousands of years later, as natural selection, evolution, and adaptation, and speciation, and gene flow, and all these other things that we know in science. but they would be doing it before Darwin's work, which made our understanding common knowledge. And we have to remember that even if you fast forward, that people like Comte de Buffon, Linnaeus, Lamarck, people, the thing about Buffon, even though all of these men, including Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, there's all this classification, all this understanding that there's the material world, but these five intellectuals and biologists and naturalists, while they moved the closer to what Darwin would eventually uncover in his research, Buffon said, "Oh, the world was 70,000 years old." That of course takes us out of the idea that there's a biblical foundation for life in terms of the world being 6,000 years old. So this was earth-shattering in 1707. And so the thing that these men, though, had in common, though, is that they tried to meld both science and religion. They tried to make them comfortable. They tried to make them co-equal. And when you try to do that, I think at least from their perspectives, there was always a discomfort and a challenge that faced all of their philosophical discussions and their discoveries of the physical world. We can also look to people who came just right before Darwin. In fact, von Humboldt, who was a very important person in Darwin's life. He was a Prussian explorer. If you've ever heard of the Humboldt Current in South America, that's named for this gentleman right here. The other fascinating thing about von Humboldt is that he was perhaps a deist, like some of our founding fathers in the United States, but he was a materialist who disregarded religion. And you could almost make the argument that von Humboldt, as a naturalist and as a scientist, was a very early free thinker. And he respected Darwin. Darwin took von Humboldt's work with him on the voyage of the Beagle. And there was a tremendous amount of a continuity between these two men in their discoveries, especially with Darwin later going to the Galapagos Islands and exploring. And certainly Wallace, who was a co-discoverer of natural selection, being in the Amazon rainforest. Von Humboldt was there first, and they had a huge impact on much later naturalists. So natural selection is really several thousand years in the making, but it's very, very simple. And it basically states the following. If you read the Origin of Species, populations will vary. Offspring will look like, but not exactly, especially with higher organisms, their parences. These differences are historical because they relate to the acceptance of traits. Now, again, what's fascinating about this is that Darwin and Wallace as well really made these profound discoveries without things like scanning electron microscopes, way before the understanding of DNA or later RNA, or the ideas that come out of learning from the microscope. So they were doing this all from observation, and they got it, for the most part, really right. So basically what the Origin of Species postulates is that there's variation and change in populations, and that they will affect the relative survivability and reproduction of the continuity of different species as they adapt to their environment. It's a very simple idea, but one that, as if we go back to Anaximander and later philosophers and biologists, you see that it really did take a long time to get there, but Darwin and Wallace really hit on it. And it's important to know a couple of things, that while we might be talking about Darwin and his ideas this context, that Darwin got a lot of things right and he got a lot of things wrong, or some things wrong. Darwin never wrote about human evolution and the origin of species. That came later in The Descent of Man. Darwin was anti-slavery, but he was not anti-patriarchy, meaning that he was not a proponent of the women's suffrage movement. And there were a lot of things happening in the 19th century, which later affected the 20th and even the 21st century in terms of the liberalization of society. And so while we can understand that Darwin is from the 19th century, and sadly, there are people who still accept the idea that the patriarchy should rule, even in the 21st century. But if we are going to hold Darwin to account for not his ideas in terms of natural selection, we have to put them in, I believe, very strong historical context. That doesn't mean that other people were not thinking about the world changing and making it a more liberal, humanistic society. Darwin's apostles, T.H. Huxley, Draper, Asa Gray, who am I leaving out here? Wallace, certainly, and Hooker. These were men who were scientists and biologists and studiers of society and advocates for Darwin, who were also advocates against imperialism, and they were pro-labor, and they were abolitionists, and they were suffragists. So all of this was happening in Darwin's time, and a lot of things Darwin got right, some of them not necessarily. But when we do talk about social Darwinism, we have to understand that Darwin really didn't talk about natural selection as a form of society. That came much later with Herbert Spencer. And while they used Darwin's work to justify the idea that societies are biological organisms, that was never Darwin's intent. And if you read Darwin's letters, and I urge you to do so, you'll see that he was very frustrated because his work was a standard bearer of biology and not sociology. So why in 1859 was Darwin so rejected? Well, if you look to your screens on the left, you see that Darwin was made a fool of for the sake of many different reasons, showing him very comically here, but really trying to show him as being wrong with his ideas, seeing that, oh, I didn't come from a monkey, how dare you, and putting his head on what looks like to be a chimpanzee is quite insulting. But Victorian England was steeped in the occult. Queen Victoria, especially after she lost her husband, was very involved in seances and tea readings. And so, the idea that there's this material world and not this supernatural world was a rejection of Darwin's work, because Darwin was firmly foundational in understanding the material world, and in a sense, the material cosmos. Certainly, just as the times in the 17th and 17th century, where religion and science were very much highly connected, you find that was still quite the case in many powerful intellectuals at the time. That did not separate religion and science. And as T.H. Huxley would later say to Darwin, that one of the things that his work did is, quote unquote, kill God because of the implications of his work. Certainly the Church of England and the Vatican were contemptuous of the origin of species and Darwin, because it meant that that the implications is that this is a godless universe, and that there's nobody interceding on our behalf, and that we are part of nature and not above nature, which organized religion tends to put us above nature frequently, and certainly God's above nature. And finally, the monarchy and social elite saw that what Darwin was saying, even though in some cases Darwin was an elitist in his own right, the monarchy saw that if we were all derived from a common ancestor, on what political basis would England, or any country for that matter, have a right to own another person's land? To be able to put their laws above, and culture above the culture and laws of some other group or groups. What gives these powerful elitists the right to take over a whole other country? And Darwin himself, was a man who really saw that his work was a danger to all of these factors. He was a man who, in his own life, had many psychosomatic and debilitating diseases. He was under tremendous pressure throughout his whole life, not only because of the big issue of what natural selection meant, but even in his home, because of his wife's belief till her death, that because Darwin had written this book, and by the way, his wife actually read Origin of Species and was in favor of him publishing it, but she saw what it meant, that if we take man away from the idea that we live forever, her fear was that, in her belief, that she was going to live forever and that she would not see Darwin in the afterlife. And that created a lot of problems for Darwin, who, although was not an atheist, certainly was an agnostic. And fast forward to even our 21st century lives, there are people who may be in a relationship with someone who is a believer and you're not a believer, and you can almost feel that tension. Or if you were a believer at some time and you're no longer a believer, understand that tension. Well, Darwin was going through this his entire adult life, and certainly through his married life. It's also important to note that his daughter Annie died at 9, several years before the publication of The Origin of Species. I think it was about 10 years before, and that haunted Darwin. And I think that was one of the great breaks in his belief system. Don't forget, Darwin started his education as a medical student and couldn't stand the sight of blood. And eventually, what do you do when you are in an elite and the son of a doctor, and you don't become a barrister? Darwin's degree is in theology. But he was haunted by the loss of Annie, and it was his real first break into calling into question this, how can there be a good and divine God if he randomly takes 9-year-olds from their families. And so Darwin was a prolific writer and researcher, collaborator, but he was not a public speaker, and never was meant to be. However, if you read his correspondence, you find that it is as deep as as wide as it is deep, and that it spans continents, with people reaching out to him and he reaching out to other people in all facets of science and discovery throughout his entire life. His correspondence is a fascinating thing to look at, and it's all been digitized. So if you look at the Darwin Correspondence Project, you can do a keyword search and see just thousands and thousands upon thousands of letters that were written by Darwin and either to or from Darwin. But these are Darwin's apostles. And again, they are the men who really did stick up for Darwin. At the time that The Origin of Species was published, T.X. Huxley, who, as many of you may know, is called Darwin's bulldog. Actually, all of these men were Darwin's bulldog. While that moniker is given to Huxley, you find that Draper and Hooker and Asa Gray were all advocates for Darwin, all wrote either under their name or anonymously to support Darwin, spoke on Darwin's behalf, debated on Darwin's behalf. Asa Gray, who was an American biologist, a very famous biologist at the time and still is important, what basically got what was the equivalent of copyright for Darwin's works in the United States. Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was the chief botanist at the Royal Kew Gardens, taking that position over from his father, was a lifelong friend of Darwin, read The Origin of Species and helped Darwin write it in some sense of the word. Huxley, of course, being the Christopher Hitchens of his day in many different ways. Alfred Russel Wallace, who is literally the co-discoverer, and we know from the scientific history, wrote that 20-page paper to Darwin in the correspondence, who, when Darwin read it, almost had a heart attack because he realized in 20 pages Wallace had basically written Natural Selection, a book that Darwin had been writing for 20 years. And also John W. Draper, who's British, but moved to America and was an advocate for Darwin in many different ways, wrote a treatise on the importance of science, and was really in the 1860 debate, while everyone sort of talks about it as being, Soapy Sam, Wilberforce against Huxley, it was actually not only just Huxley who spoke on Darwin's behalf, but also Joseph Hooker and also John W. Draper. And it's very interesting because a year before the publication of Origin of Species on June 30th, 1858, you have the joint paper of Wallace and Darwin being submitted to the Linnaean Society, basically as a coming out party for the idea of natural selection. And this was modeled on and advocated for by Joseph Hooker, as well as Huxley. And then almost 2 years later, on June 30th in 1860, you have the great debate of evolution against Wilberforce, which, when you read the reports of the time, that the evolutionists won out, if you will. So, if we go forwards in time now, you find that, very famous biologist, the Polish biologist Theodorus Dobzhansky, said nothing in biology would make sense without evolution being a cornerstone to our understanding of nature. And Darwin, going backwards now, figured out what would become evolution and descent through modification earlier on, way earlier, 10, 15 years, he was writing in his diaries, and he wrote this very famous schematic where he wrote, "I think," and here you see the whole idea of things like adaptation, speciation, extinction, three of the core tenets of what is natural selection being played out way before The Origin of Species is ever published. And here it is, the tree of life. If we go back to Linnaeus, he would be dumbfounded by this. because there are no gods or angels or archangels in here, but just all of the phylums of nature, and all operating on the same thing that Darwin wrote about in 1840. And of course, you'll accept my own discussion of the tree as Darwin being the apical ancestor, impacting not only Darwin's apostles, but later on people like Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins and Dennett and the Horsemen and Ingalls and Marx and Dewey and people from all around the sciences and the philosophers who we've come to know and trust with not only our understanding of the past, but being a pillar for us to understand the present and the future. And so here you have a tree again with all of the areas where natural selection has in some way impacted these disciplines, whether they're the soft sciences or the hard sciences, the social sciences, the arts, religious studies, environmental science, genomics, obviously, chemistry, natural history, geography, geology, biology, psychology, all connected in some way and owe the modern sense of their understanding because of what came out through natural selection. So Darwin liberated us from the inadequacies of a theologically centered view of the cosmos. The earth is not 6,000 years old. It is not one turtle on top of another turtle. We are not the center of the universe. Species can die out. The environment changes. Animals change over time. And there's a liberation that comes from understanding, and not only understanding, but accepting this. And the other thing that he's done is being able to give us an idea of the world where we don't have to depend on patriarchy or any form of imperialism to find solace or structure within our own lives. In fact, because of what we know about our modern world and our material world, and we owe so much of that to Darwin's work, that we can be, as the American Humanist Association notes, that we can be good without God. That one of the tenets of the humanistic platform is that we accept the material world. Well, what's more material, I ask you, than an understanding and acceptance of natural selection? And of course, at the time, and I touched on this earlier, you find that there's so much going on in the 19th century in both the United States, but in America, you have prison reform, you have education reform, the women's suffrage movement, the anti-slavery movement, labor rights. All of this is happening at a time where natural selection fits into that scheme of revolution, not only social revolution and liberation, but liberating us from the idea that we are apart from the material and natural world. And we see this also even in the writings, as I mentioned earlier, of Marx. It was clear that Marx, while he didn't like the way Darwin wrote, accepted and understood the content of Origin of Species, and he saw in it the destruction of the idea of teleology, which is the idea of understanding function, but not necessarily causality. And I think that's where, if you study intelligent design philosophy, because it's not really science, is that where you're always trying to look at, well, what is the function? What Darwin does is says, no, we have to look back at not just the function, but where this all came from and why it came to into reality. And Marx was such a fan of Darwin that he even in Das Kapital sent Darwin a copy and ascribed to it that he is a sincere admirer of the man. Ingalls, the same thing, the idea that we are not apart from nature. And that's the importance of Darwin's work right there, that we are not above nature. And that has a huge impact on our understanding of not only where we came from and who we are now, but what we might do in the future in terms of society, without looking at social Darwinism, but understanding that if you come from nature and that there's nothing divine giving you responsibility, then it's up to us to make the world a better place for each other. And the last person I would mention is Peter Kropotkin, who, if you talk about being good without God, basically said that Darwin's implications for evolution helps us understand that that empathy played a huge role in our own evolution, and that while quote unquote survival of the fittest is at play on the biological level, that it's clear that a cooperation rather than competition has led us to who we are today. And fast forward 100 years later, well, that's what the scientists basically say. So you see this impact consistently thanks to Darwin's writings. But we're here really to talk about the free thought movement. So now let's get into a little bit more of the meat of how it is that if we're looking at the evolution of the movement, which we are all, I think, a part of, to understand that our legacies are tied to the legacies of those who came before us. Certainly that's an evolutionary point of view, but it's consistent because if you know anything about some of the people who I'm going to write about, you'll see that their work is so important to our philosophy of humanism and materialism in today's world, so in social rights or civil rights or the sciences, but they were impactful in their own time as well. So of course we have Ingersoll, who was the great agnostic, who really was the rock star of the 19th century. I mean, this is before blogs existed. This is before even in some cases the telegraph existed. People would follow this man around the United States in his debates about an anti-theology, more humanistic way for us to be towards each other in not only his speeches, but also in his debates with people who would hold that we would need to be good, that we have to be good only with God. Of course, Ingersoll rejected that. And he not only were his debates and talks reprinted in newspapers around the country, he would write, and this was what they did in the 19th century, write these 2-penny pamphlets, which would be distributed around the country for his ideas to come out. Now we have Snapchat and blogs and websites and all those things. But in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, that stuff didn't exist. And in Victorian Infidels, Ingersoll mentions that this will be known as Darwin's century, that his work has global impact. And not only for persuading people to understand the material world, but for dissuading people to take a theological view of the world. Here's another one in the works of Robert Ingersoll. And I won't read each of them to you, but it's clear that, the idea of the mythology of the Garden of Eden and things like that really don't have any foundation in fact. And if we're going to look at facts, we have to look at Darwin's work to lead us in that way. And of course, here's Ingersoll in Ingersoll the Magnificent, writing that Darwin destroyed the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. I'll give you one more in the works of Robert Ingersoll, where he ties not only Voltaire and Hume and Paine and Darwin, but he also talks about Draper as having more of a significant impact on the world. And he mentions the danger of a theological view of the world, which discredits or abandons science for the sake of theology. The next person I think is important to understand, who was a really important 19th century free thinker, is D.M. Bennett. He was the publisher of the Truth Seeker newspaper, which was the first free thinker humanist newspaper ever to be published in the United States. He was editor in charge. He serialized in the newspaper because not everybody could afford to buy The Descent of Man. He serialized The Descent of Man in his newspapers. And he would constantly laud as chief editor, writing from a humanistic and free thinker point of view, the work of Darwin as W.E.B. Du Bois would say, as liberating us from not only physical slavery, but intellectual slavery. And it was in the, also very, very important, in Darwin's later years, one of the last interviews Darwin gave before he died in 1882 was to Edward Aveling, who was a British biologist and writer, who basically suggested that he is not an atheist, but that he is an agnostic. And it took him 40 years to sort of leave the fold. But when he did, the world became a happier place for him. So this was published in The Truth Seeker. Of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we understand as being a very important person for the women's suffrage movement, saw Darwin's work as very, very important because she said at the time that if women controlled their reproductive lives, that they would have power, and that they could manage the time and place if they chose to have offspring. Stanton took from Darwin's work the essential idea that we live in the material world and that men and women were equal. Here are some things that she wrote in The Pleasures of Age, that were governed by laws. And in this case, she was also alluding to the law of natural selection, and that we live in the material world, again, hearkening back to Darwin. And that is really important for the understanding of our equality. She also was very anti-theistic, and she wrote that the Bible degrades women. And it's clear that the last thing you want to do is raise another generation of boys to learn the Bible, because they in turn will disrespect women. Andrew Dixon White is a very important humanist, American humanist, and free thinker. Some of the things to know about White: he published a great series of books. He went during the American Civil War to both France and England and ensured that both France and England would not give resources to the Confederacy. So this is very, very important, obviously. He helped found Cornell University. And in the 19th century, you saw this huge rise of universities and colleges being born, if you will, and many of them having religious foundation, because that's where the money was. And it was Dixon White who made sure that Cornell was founded as a secular institution, not to be affiliated with any religious institution. And if you think about the importance of that, well, think about some of the people who eventually went to Cornell, either as a student or as a professor. And I can think of two very important people, such as Carl Sagan, oh my goodness, why is Neil deGrasse Tyson? So we have a lot to thank to Dixon White for not only his recognition of the evils of slavery, but the importance of our understanding our world through the material sense. And he wrote about Darwin's work as well, saying that the attacks on Darwin would eventually, in his time and in time forever, would fall into nothingness because Darwin's work was secure. Knowledge was primary to this man, and he made sure that people understood that and his support of Darwin. In the UK, you have Charles Bradlaugh, who he and Annie Besant were really firebrands for both women's rights, equal rights, labor rights, free thought. They were each put on trial for supporting a document that was published for disseminating what was considered a morally corrupt implication, which was written several years earlier by a physician to tell women how to avoid to get pregnant. And because they disseminated it, they were ordered to stop producing the publication. They promptly ignored it and printed hundreds of thousands of copies of it. Also, Charles Bradlaugh, aside from publishing what was the equivalent of the Freethinker in the US, was the National Reformer in the UK. He's a founding member of the National Secular Society. And he actually went to jail because when he was elected to Parliament, he refused to put his hand on a Bible to take his oath to join Parliament. So it's important to understand. Bradlaugh not only published the National Reformer, but he published an awful lot of other pamphlets and other authors at the time. He was sort of the person that people went to in England if they wanted to get their free thought or atheist or agnostic or science ideas out to the public. And in Cockbill's Darwin is in Atheist, the platform, you see that there's discussion of the supernatural versus the importance of Darwin's work to refute the supernatural. Here's another quote. And still another, this is a reprint of Garrison's The Absence of Design in Nature. And again, this is happening 100 years ago, way before creationism, even though creationism has existed since the Bible, right? Because if you believe in creation, you're a believer in mythology. But he's writing here saying the doctrine of evolution and natural selection explains more about the world than any theology could ever. And another writing of Avelin's work really protested when they reinterred Darwin when he died in 1882, was buried in a small private cemetery, and the Royal Church of England exhumed his body and laid him to his final rest in Westminster Abbey. And I've been there several times to pay my respects. And Aveling, of course, spoke out about this, saying, these people, when Darwin was alive, would make fun of him and chastise him and made his life miserable. Yet in his death and in his popularity as it grew, then opened their arms and accepted him as one of his own. And basically Avelin was calling the hypocrisy of that into call. Annie Besant, as I mentioned, was a free thinker. She was a member of the Fabian Society. While she saw the harshness of natural selection in terms of, well, if there's nothing divine controlling things, life can be very tough when you're living on the savannah and you're either going to be eaten by the lion, or you're going to escape the lion. She saw it as a part of our success as humans to understand that and to see humans as a part of nature as well. She lauded Darwin in many different ways. She published in 1877, not 5 years before Charles Darwin's death, a book called On Being the Human Conduct of Morals, where in this 47-page pamphlet, she alluded to Darwin and his work at more than 5 times. And here's another quote from Annie Besant. So we'll move forward from some of the 19th century people and some of the people who made it through some of the 20th century, closer to our time, certainly. George William Foote, who people don't remember. He was British freethinker, was the second publisher, and a student of Bradlaugh, and a tremendous secular leader. He compared Darwin's fundamental work to the importance of Newton. And if you hearken back to one of my first slides, where we talk about what are the most important ideas, scientific ideas in this world, and natural selection or evolution is one of the top 10, here you have this man writing the same thing in 1889, some 7 years after the death of Charles Darwin. This is written by George Foote, and I think it's important because it, again, puts us firmly in the material world and the scientific world, and helps us understand not only what our human past is, but possibly what our human destiny can be when we look at the world through natural ideas about the fundamental mechanics of nature and science itself. I'll give you one more, or 2 more. Or 3 more. I forgot how many are in here. I apologize to you. Now here's Chapman Cone, who also was a contemporary of George Foote, and he made it all the way through, the mid 1950s. So he saw World War I, he saw World War II, he saw the Scopes monkey trial in the United States, he saw the pressure being put on those who would accept evolution in Europe as well as in the United States. And he was an important free thinker as well. And I recommend, because many of these books that Foote and Cone have written are available because they've been digitized by either the Library of Congress or through other nonprofits, where you can actually go back and read their writings, and you will see in their writings, which not only is there a dependence on Darwin, but a reliance on humanism, on the idea of being our ethics come from within us, not from above us. The idea that we can make the world a better place through understanding the mechanics of nature. And so these are all really important people who our later 20th century people looked at and researched in their own writings before they would publish. And here are these people going back further in time to Darwin. Here's a quote from Evolution in Christianity, from his book, Evolution in Christianity. And that we can get our ethics by understanding evolution. Because if we view the natural world as being one that is accessible and not needing a requirement of the divine, then Darwin's work has even more profound significance for who we are as a species. So I learned a long time ago, I got my doctorate degree in the late Jurassic, right before the asteroid hit and killed off the dinosaurs. But one of the things I remember being told over and over again, why does this matter? Okay, you're writing your dissertation. Why is it that what you're writing about matters? And so the question always comes to me fundamentally as an academic and as someone who's taught about science and the acceptance of evolution, is that why should we care? Why does it matter to us? Why should it matter to us? Why is it important to us? And I think there's a couple of things. In the United States, acceptance of natural selection is not a majority necessarily viewpoint. There are many places in this country and places around the world where natural selection is considered an illegal thing to understand or know, where it is not in textbooks, where there is the need in certain states within the United States to say that evolution is just a theory, denigrating Darwin's work. And you find that that other countries have a much greater acceptance of the material world and what that means to them in terms of politics, economics, the social safety net. And so there's almost an inverse relationship between how well a society accepts the natural world and Darwin's work and how it takes care of its citizens. And we've certainly not done a good enough job in educating everyone in this country. This slide is a few years old, but the numbers haven't changed that dramatically. If you look at the PISA average scores, where does the United States find itself in math? Well, somewhere around 38th to 40. In reading, around the 28th in terms of success. In science, acceptance and understanding, around 29th and 30th in the world. So when people say we're number one, if you look at this, maybe not so. And that has huge implications, right? In terms of how we speak to one another, it has how well we understand the world, our politics, our economics. I doubt on January 6th, when people were storming the Capitol, that there were many, if any, PhDs in that mob of insurrectionists. And I think the failure here is to understand that we need to do a better job of educating not only the children who will lead this country in the future for political and economic and social justice reasons, but also their parents. Because fear doesn't get us anywhere. Certainly fear of evolution doesn't get us anywhere. And you can go to Kentucky right now, right? You can go to the Creation Museum and its sister attraction, the Ark Park, and be steeped in mythology and see the whole idea of the world being just 6,000 years old, promulgated as if it was true. If that does not ring a bell of resentment for your intellectual faculties, then I would hope you will consider understanding the negative implications of something like this. When you see dioramas of children next to velociraptors, you realize that there's something wrong with that. And I like to call it's basically Flintstone science. If you got your science from the Flintstones, you're probably not going to be working at Cornell University in the near future, or any university for that matter. And I just throw this in because I always think it's funny. Oh crap, was that today? And fast forward to the world in which we live in now. These are people in the just this last administration who would be happy to go to war, happy to stand in the way of our understanding and the effective nature of science, happy to stand in the way of public education, happy to stand in the way of acceptance of evolution, happy to promote the idea that you can only be good with God. Former Senator Santorum, when the Bush administration was doing the No Child Left Behind laws, he put a rider in a bill saying that we have to teach the controversy. That if you're going to get money to public education, that you have to teach other ideas in biology class of how we got here. So it was a proponent of creationism and intelligent design. Mike Pence, when he was in Congress, stood, and you can look at the congressional record, and he said that the world can only be explained through a biblical point of view. And that for all our machinations of science, eventually we'll come to the realization that his interpretation of the Bible is the right one. And then, of course, you have the Discovery Institute, which writes bills denying or trying to stop the teaching of evolution and almost weekly. With Rick Santorum, that amendment to the bill never made it, thank goodness. But they tried to structurally make the teaching of intelligent design co-equal to the understanding of evolution. So in summary, and as I close, I like to think about why this work is so important and foundational and wonderful to know. And it's pretty simple. There's a duality here. Ideas change people, and people with ideas change the world. And that's certainly something you can say about Charles Darwin, about the apostles, about all the free thinkers in the 19th and 20th century, and dare I say, each one of us, because we stand on the shoulders of giants, my friends. And that as a single species, with all this human variation and all these characteristics that show differences in skin tone or height or eye color, that it makes no difference. We are part of the same human family. And that we're all part of this huge, big story that even predates us. And you can see behind me some of the co-runners going back 8 million years in our own fossil history. And as I mentioned before, that without evolution, as Dobransky said, nothing would make sense. So too is that understanding in our humanistic philosophy, in our secularism, in our ethics, in our understanding that we can be good without God. And we owe a lot of that to understanding the material world. And we owe a lot of that understanding of the material world to Charles Darwin and his research and his observations, his writings, and his work. And that we should enliven the idea. We should feel prosperous because we have this knowledge. That it doesn't negate anything. That it doesn't even negate the idea of spirituality. That is, I could, as a non-believer and as someone who is a secular humanist, look up at the stars, and be full of spiritual wonder about humanity's place in the cosmos. And that makes me feel really special, because the idea that I even exist is so random. The idea that any one of us exists is so random. So because these ideas have changed the world, it's almost incumbent on each of us to be apostles of Darwin as well, and to be able to bring this forward to the next generation. And with that, I have probably spoken way longer than I was supposed to, but I'll stop now, and I thank you for your time and attention. This conversation that we're having today does not negate the idea that now we are all in some form of communication or communion, not in the religious sense, and that if anybody who's watching this today or who will watch it in the future wishes to seek me out, not to necessarily do a presentation, but just talk, I'm happy to do that. I feel like it's my responsibility to be part of something bigger. And these talks that you're doing are really, really important, but they shouldn't be, when we end the Zoom meeting today, be the end. And so I hope that anyone who is on today's Zoom meeting and in the future will seek me out if they have questions or comments or concerns.
So I don't know if this was a serious question or a rhetorical one, but I feel like it's only fair to bring it up since it's connected to your title of the talk. If Darwin is so fundamental, should we call him a basal ancestor rather than a apical?
Someone studying biology there. Well, as they say, a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. So however you want to think about Charles Darwin in the light of this talk, I welcome you to do so.
Great.
Sure.
Why did Darwin get all the credit for evolution and Wallace got very little credit?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have a very good friend in the UK. His name is George Bellaconi, who is responsible for culminating the Wallace letters and making them searchable and livable. And he is a Wallace scholar. And the reality is that I think there was never a time, if you spoke to Wallace, who lived into the early 20th century, he never felt like Darwin outshined him. He was very humbled that, don't forget, Darwin was his elder, and Wallace, to his credit, felt very strongly that Darwin should get as much of credit as possible. And with that also came the intense criticism. So in a way, Wallace was able to duck a little bit about that, even though we clearly note him as the co-discoverer of natural selection. We think about Darwin primarily in that sense. So Wallace never had sour grapes over not getting the criticism or the fanfare. It was very important back in 1858, though, that when Darwin and Wallace presented their natural selection to the Linnaean Society, they did so as equals.
So I'm going to consolidate two questions. So kind of the first part is somebody who has spent a lot of time and energy trying to persuade and debate with their relatives, friends, and colleagues without much progress, I guess, about evolution, and wonders about if you have ideas on how you would do it. And then the sort of the connected second part was we also had somebody who wondered if you could recommend one action to help combat the anti-evolutionist ideas being propagated.
Okay. So, you know, well, this can be, these questions are really, really important, and they're almost fundamental to the question of what do we do next? You know, if we are going to be sort of apostles of Darwin, how best to do that? Let's not forget that there are people who will not change their mind because they truly are believers.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, it depends on the person who and their energy, because you may not be successful. You have to understand that you may not be successful. But that doesn't mean that if maybe your uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table will bring up the world is 6,000 years old, maybe you can get to his kids, you know, and take them aside and say, I understand you might be thinking this, or you might have learned this, but here's something else you should know about. You know, I think there's two ways that in my own research on how people become humanists or activists, that they really come from it in two ways. Either you never had faith, or you really, meaning that even if you had a faith tradition, you never really subscribed to it, or there was some catalyst in your life as an adult which brought you out of it. Now, you can be that catalyst for some people, but it's up to the person to change. And we can't change everybody. We can only do the best we can. That doesn't mean that we denigrate anybody for their beliefs. That doesn't mean that we treat them any less human than they are. Because if we are truly humanist, then on some level there has to be an acceptance of their individuality. That doesn't mean that you don't work as an activist when Uncle Joe tries to take away women's right to choose. That doesn't mean that if Uncle Joe is on the school board and he wants to put intelligent design in the school books, that you don't have a right as a secularist. And don't forget, the United States is a secular country, right? That you don't fight the good fight for stuff like that. So it's really, you can hit it from a lot of different ways, but you also don't want to, I think, there was a study done not that long ago where where the question was, what if it was it just shown in reality that everything you believed about whatever God or religious faith you are was factually incorrect? Would you at that point stop believing? And the majority of the people who responded to this question said no. And so you have to look at it from the idea of indoctrination and the idea of culture and the idea of power. There's so many different ways. And the idea of fear. What do I have if I don't have God? What do I have if I don't have that? Now, I think we can make the argument that you have plenty. We have each other, we have love, we have humanism, we have ethics, we have morals, we have science, we have all these wonderful things. And I forgot the second part of the question.
Oh, it was in terms of one action that you would recommend people take. And we actually have some other people in the chat saying how do I be an activist for evolution?
Okay, well, so one thing you can do, certainly, and first of all, there's a lot of things you can do. There's no one right way to be an activist, whether it's evolution or whether it's anything you can think of, the environment or anything, right? So you can be an activist by being someone who is an educator. You can be an activist where if you don't want to be a public speaker, but you have some resources, you can define your activism by giving to charities. You can define your activism by just being in community with other people who think like you. And then, of course, there's the outreach portion, which is working with people who may not think like you, but who, if they can see you as a human and as sincere, you can at least take away their fear of the idea.
Do you know the percentage of people who believe in evolution?
Well, in my house, there's at least me. No, kidding. I think the last research I saw, and this is also because of the rise of the nuns and the rise of, NONES versus NUNS, that secularism is on the rise, non-belief is on the rise, that you have a staunch 1/3 of the American populace who accept that there is not divine creation. You might have another third who accept the idea of the material universe and that we evolved, but are here because God started it all, meaning that they try to have religion and science be co-equal. And it gets back to the fundamental question is, how did we get here, right? For a lot of us on this Zoom, it's the Big Bang, but for others, it's like, well, God put it all into motion. In fact, that's the Roman Catholic Church at this point, which was very anti-Darwin, but now accepts the material world, but just says, well, God put it all into motion. So that's about another third. So you might say that there's 2/3, with one third being a core of non-believers and non-belief connected to evolution. And then you have the 1/3 that are not accepting of natural selection at all, and either do so in their own private lives or are activists in trying to dismiss Darwin and dismiss science. Sort of like I'm a professor, and so when I go into every classroom, I go by the law of thirds as well. There's about 1/3 of my students who will be engaged. There are 1/3 of my students who just want the A and don't really care about the subject, and there's 1/3 who don't know why they're there whatsoever.
Well, connected to that, there is a question about, in the classes that you teach, do you get students who verbally oppose teaching of evolution?
I get students who do question it, absolutely. And I never back down, but I never stop anyone. I never make anyone feel bad for their beliefs. But I say that this is a class in science, and that if you want to study the biblical idea of the creation of the world, then you can't do it in this physical anthropology course, which is based on science. Please take a course in philosophy or religion, because that's where you'll get it. And I always start my class by noting that this is a course that may confront your beliefs and how we got here. In all my years of teaching evolution and the sciences and anthropology based on this, and it's been 20 years at least. I know I'm getting older because now I'm getting my students. Oh, you had my mother back in like 1982 or 1987, and I'm like, uh-oh. I'm getting old. Where was I going with this? But I've only had one student in all this time who ever dropped my class because they were so confronted by what I was teaching them.
Can you explain more about Chapman Cohen, about how he saw Darwin's work as the path to a non-theological system of ethics?
Yeah, I mean, Chapman Cohen was a big proponent, and comes from the British school of humanism and secularism, and was a tremendous proponent of Darwin's work, because he saw Darwin's work as fundamental to our understanding of the material universe, and that if you took a material universal view of the world, a world without God, right, that means that our ethics have to come from within inside of us, and that there might be a biological a place in our genes for empathy, but if there isn't, then there's a social responsibility within each of us to be moral and ethical towards each other, because aside from the fact that we are all one human family, the roller coaster ends. The party will end one day for us. And knowing that, it means, especially with Chapman Cohen, who wrote so much and was such a great writer about morality and ethics and understanding ethics from a scientific point of view and accepting Darwin, was that, this is the one shot we have. And we better make it as pleasant as possible, in his Britishness, as he would say.
Why did Darwin support patriarchy? Did he explain that part of his worldview?
Yeah, I mean, Darwin, in his writings, he did not, of course, support Bradlaugh and Besant. Bradlaugh and Besant, when they were on trial for distribution of this publication about women's right to choose their biology, they wrote to Darwin and asked for his support, and he chose not to give it. Darwin, as I like to say, and we talked earlier, was right about a lot of things in biology, but was not right about a lot of things related to human relations. And one of those things, he saw women as the fairer sex, if you will, that they had to be protected. He felt that if women were allowed to choose the timing of their childbirth, that it would have a huge impact on the potential survivability of our species. And so, he was not, a 21st century thinker, as a lot of us are here on this Zoom call. And as I mentioned before, sadly, there are a lot of people in the 21st century who sort of still think like Darwin in the 19th century, based on a whole host of issues and beliefs. But Darwin, it didn't mean that Darwin did not respect women. It did not mean that Darwin didn't love his wife and love his children. Again, when Annie died, it was profoundly, it made him a profoundly sad man. But, he grew up in this Victorian age, and he was a man of wealth, and he, it was a time when women were not getting educated, and, women went to school to learn to become ladies and not really to use their minds necessarily. And so that was the culture that Darwin grew up in and appreciated, for just not only for social reasons, but for his views on evolution as well.
So I apologize to the folks whose questions we're not able to get to. I do want to respect everyone's time. So David, can you leave us with some final thoughts, maybe a call to action or recommendations on other sources of education that you would direct us to?
Okay, sure. First of all, I want to thank you again for offering me the opportunity to speak tonight. I would say that if you are ready and willing to take up the mantle, and if I fired you up, uh, good. It's good to be fired up. You know, if you can, I know this is a time of COVID. Get out there, wear masks, socially distance, but try to be part of the AHA community or humanist community or secular community in some way. Make your ideas known. Make your feelings understood. Don't fear the future. Make the future. As you know, Martin Luther King Jr. said, since this is Black History Month, is that each of us have a responsibility to be the change. So let's be the change, however best and however way you define that. There you go.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to everybody for joining us. Um, we appreciate you coming here to learn. We also hope that you'll be interested in some of our other programs and
Absolutely.
all of our other work. So if you're not already a member of the American Humanist Association, you can go to americanhumanist.org/join. And if you are or still want to support our work, in other ways, you can go to americanhumanist.org/donate. Thank you all again for joining us and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.